You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Bryan Most and Don Davis.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Bryan Most, SVP of Retail Strategy at NYSHEX and former VP of Supply Chain at Walmart.
And I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And we're back again with our podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. Today, our topic is going to be, I've signed my annual contract. Now what? So, Don, I think this topic is relevant. We're about 30 days till May 1, and most new contracts for the Trans-Pacific eastbound trade will be signed over the next couple of weeks. So, if you're a supply chain manager or carrier trade manager, does this mean you can kick your feet up and take that well-deserved vacation?
Yeah, I'm sure the golf courses are going to be very busy with carrier employees out there on the links. If that could only ever happen, I'm sure a lot of people would be happy. But unfortunately, there's not much rest in this industry. There's always something that comes up, even after some of the best planning you might have. You look at what happened with the Suez Canal and the ripple effects there. There's always something, it seems, in this industry to keep you on your toes.
You're exactly right about that. I don't think there's going to be many shippers out on the golf course either. But I think it's a great topic to discuss because I think there certainly has been a ton of activity on early contract signings and trying to get things wrapped up, just so you can feel a degree of comfort that you have some of your volume covered, but maybe you didn't get everything covered. And maybe we can give some perspectives on if you're one of those shippers, what you should be thinking about as you go into the summer months, and before we know it, the peak season will be here. So Don, what are some of your thoughts at this point? If you're a carrier, if you're a shipper, you've signed some early agreements. What do you start to look at? What do you start to think about?
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of, first of all, taking a look at how did you end up? Did you get everything that you wanted? And I think this year it's a difficult year. So the likelihood that you got everything you wanted, whether that's space or terms, et cetera, is probably pretty unlikely. But I think it's assessing where you stand and then starting to adjust as a shipper for areas of focus for you. What are those important things that still might be missing? Because from a carrier side, now that they've concluded the majority of their contracts, they're trying to figure out a few things. They're looking at, okay, where do I have some density that I might have some issues? And how do I respond to that? Do I need to build up inventory in Southeast Asia? Do I need to build up inventory in South China? So they're going to start to look at those kinds of things. But also, and I think top of mind for a carrier is, how do I leverage the capacity I've left to take advantage of value-added services or premium products? Because that is absolutely something that's going to be important for carriers, and something where, given the success they had last year, it's absolutely true that carriers have some capacity available for that. And then how do you start to leverage that?
Yeah, those are some good points that I want to pick up on. I'll start from the shipper perspective. I agree, like you, that it's time for just a quick postmortem. Sure that you feel good, you've signed some deals, but you just got to go back to what those goals or priorities are that you started the season with. And for most shippers that I've talked to, it was purely around space. It's not that the rates aren't important, but for the first time in a long time, I don't think rates were the primary, discussion topic. It was what will you cover in terms of MQCs versus my forecasted volume. And so, to your point, it's a matter of figuring out where those gaps are. And it might be just looking at some of the unique characteristics of your network or seasonal needs that you had, or, as you said, value-added terms. A big topic a month or two ago was that I think carriers were not going to be as flexible when it came to free time or credit terms or boilerplate types of concessions. And so, were some of those things, are there things out there that you didn't achieve, and what are the implications on your network? And how do you position yourself to overcome whatever those challenges were that you didn't get, we've heard a lot of shippers talk about diversification and redundancy. So were you able to achieve that, whether it's diversification across carriers or trying to participate a little bit in each alliance? I mean, the Suez has brought up this issue of if I'm going to the east coast of the United States, do I have a little bit Panama and a little bit Suez just to be sure that I can always flow freight? So, there's all kinds of things: direct carriers versus NVOCCs, committed contracts versus traditional. I think all those things you take a look at, and then you probably had service challenges and issues from year before. So did you do things or did you accomplish things that are going to address some of those challenges you had to minimize disruption? And then finally, it's all about freight spend. So, there's some kind of optimization that typically happens in tender season. And so what does your optimization tell you? Things certainly won't come out perfect, but if you come out 90%, do you come within your freight spend that your CFO or your supply chain executive asked you to fill? So those are all the things that I'm looking at. And then to your point, Don, then it's what solutions are available to you to start to fill the gaps that you identify. And I think you touched on a couple with carriers. But what do you think about this idea? A typical approach is to do a gap bid. Just knowing how challenging first round negotiations were to get contracts, do you think gap bids at this point will work or are a viable strategy?
I do. I think that makes a lot of sense to do something along those lines. I think any indication you can give to a carrier that, hey, I have additional capacity that I need, and I'm thinking about this looks like a time frame of when I might need it, is going to be helpful, because I think while carriers are thinking about those value-added services and premium products and how to plan their capacity, there's also some thought around extra loaders, and you can see some carriers already out there planning on having some extra loaders. And I think the more indication you can give to a carrier that, hey, I'm not done, I'm not satisfied with the type of capacity I have available to me, I'm going to need more. That's important to indicate to a carrier, because internally, carriers are asking the question, what are you hearing from your customers? What do their forecasts look like? Is the market going to continue to be strong? So it's important that the carrier teams, the commercial teams, are aware of your intentions and where you stand, so carriers can make decisions, because no carrier wants to go out and get an extra loader and have it be underutilized. So it's very important that that message is communicated, and the more you can give accurate forecasts, the more you can deliver timing mechanisms of, this is when I think things are going to be strong for me, is vital to the carrier, because there are some things they can do, but they need the information in order to plan.
No, I mean, that's really helpful to understand. And you also touched on an important point of, I think as a shipper at this point, you also just reassess just what your perspective on the market is. We've talked for months about this structural change and movement in the market, and there's been debate on whether that is actually the case, or will carriers just go back to their old ways now that their pockets are flush with cash, and they're going to order a bunch of ships and we'll get right back into overcapacity. I think you and I have said on previous, podcasts that we don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. But as a shipper, you don't have a whole lot of additional data points, but you've got a few more months, right, of data under your belt. And I think when I think about what I would be looking at is, certainly you had a lot of contracts signed early, and a lot of capacity was essentially reserved. So that doesn't mean there's probably a whole lot that's left over. To your point, there might be pockets, or there might be additional capacity created, right, through extra loaders and others. But this idea that there's a lot of extra capacity left is probably not the case. I think from a rate standpoint, from what I understand, the majority of contracts concluded at profitable levels for carriers. So there's obviously a benchmark that's out there that tells me that there's no reason for carriers to go below that. Certainly, as the year goes on, I mean, I think at this point, they're only probably pricing above, whether it's for NVOs or spot deals or what have you. So, I'm probably thinking, if I'm going to do a gap bid, or if I'm looking at extra loaders, I probably have to assume that there's going to be limited opportunities, and the rates are probably going to be north of where I signed an annual deal. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think carriers are going to deploy capacity, any additional capacity they deploy, extra loader or what have you, is going to be for a premium. And I think that is very motivating for carriers because now they're going to have, they're looking at a pretty good result, right? That they've been able to increase the long-term contract rate. But now that becomes the benchmark. And given that the market's continued to be strong, I don't really see that changing. So it wouldn't make sense for a carrier to discount something. I expect the rates are going to be high. And I think that it's going to be more important around those opportunities that you have to obtain additional capacity. And again, I just think it's really important to work with your carriers and communicate your interest there because for a carrier, it's not just about an extra load or an extra ship. It's about the equipment inventory too, and they have to make sure that they have the equipment there to support what your demands are. So I just think there's a way to work together, and whether that's through a gap bid, whether that's through a regular forecast or communication, I think it's really important to make sure your carriers understand this.
No, I totally agree. But I guess for me, it just points to the fact that as a shipper, it's on you to probably get creative, this year to fill those opportunities. And I think, yeah, there's the chance to be collaborative with your carrier partner, but they might not be beating down your door like they have been in previous years on these opportunities for additional growth. So when I'm thinking about gap bid two from a shipper perspective, I've got to be careful, right? Because I've got my incumbent carriers that I've already gone through a tender with, and I already know what I have. And in some cases, they may have already told me my MQC was limited to what I had previous year or something else. So now I might be in a position where I'm going to non-incumbent carriers and potentially starting a new relationship with a carrier that hasn't existed before. Not that that's a bad thing, but that also doesn't turn around really quick sometimes. Sometimes there's an investment in understanding the corporate relationship, legal reviews, the time it takes to onboard a new supplier, all the data connections, things of that nature. So if you're in a position where you didn't get the majority of what you needed by May 1 and you're going to a gap bid to fulfill needs that are 30, 60, 90 days, I would move pretty quick on that because that could take some time. And then the same thing, I think with NVOCCs, I think NVOs might even be pressured this year. And I'd love to hear your perspective on how much flexibility or capacity you think they might be offering to shippers or BCOs, after May 1, because that was a viable outlet for a lot of shippers last year. But also shippers realized that wasn't a silver bullet either because they maybe didn't really understand who the underlying carrier was or didn't have credit terms or there wasn't any reporting or visibility, and that just led to operational challenges and administrative issues down the road. So if we talk about NVOs, what kind of an option do you think shippers are going to have there?
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up when we're talking about the gap bids. That it's not just the carriers, right? That there's an NVO opportunity here, and I do think it's important to work with NVOs, particularly if you feel that you didn't get everything you wanted in terms of capacity, because the NVOs are going to provide an outlet for shippers that they have capacity that they're allocating with the carriers. Now, I think everybody is getting squeezed this year, whether you're a shipper or an NVO. Carriers are limiting those MQCs to customers, which I don't think is all bad necessarily. I mean, maybe I wanted 50,000 and I only got 30,000, but I think as long as the carrier is giving you 30,000 and can commit to delivering that 30,000, that's better than just having an artificial number that you feel good about that you're not really getting. So I do think across the board, companies are getting restricted on the MQCs that they're being given, but I do think it represents an outlet for shippers. And I also think that there's this component of FAK, which carriers are absolutely leaving space available for the FAK. And there's an expectation that that FAK rate level is going to be somewhere above those fixed levels. But that's okay. You might have then an outlet with through FAK. And then on top of that, you might have some value added services where you can get some priorities and you can count on another level of space. But again, you're going to have to pay for it. But I think that's really becoming the new normal as this market continues to be strong and carriers manage their capacity. They're going to be looking for that value added cargo to kind of top off their ship. But it's not going to be, you know, 50% of the ship. It's probably going to be more like 10%, 5%, depending on the corridor. But there's definitely going to be capacity available. It's just going to be expensive.
Yeah. I think your example is a good one. If you wanted 50,000 committed in MQCs and you only ended up getting 30 with either one or multiple carriers, I think you're right. If that 30,000 comes with service guarantees and a really good chance that the carrier is going to do what's expected, I think that's fine. But as a shipper, you've got still 20,000 uncovered. And if that carrier didn't give you any seasonal flexibility or it's MQC divided by 52, like we've talked about before, now that puts you as a shipper in a position where that 20,000 may come in a seasonal or peak period of time that you really need to think through on how you're going to cover that. One of the things that I heard became a bit more popular this year was whether it's kind of two rates. You've got your base contract rate for your MQC that's conservative, and then you've got a second rate that's more of a peak or an overflow rate. Or Don, I think you and I have talked and heard before around just pre-negotiated flex up premium of like 20% for X amount. Those things were taken into account. So if you didn't take advantage of that with your incumbents first round, is it still an opportunity to go back and say, hey, here's where I came out. I still need some seasonal help. Is there the opportunity to do either a flex up or some kind of a peak rate in case I need more support?
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% think that's the way to go. If I'm a shipper and I felt short that I didn't get where I wanted to be, and I'm wondering, what am I going to do? I know I'm going to have a surge in the summer. Things are already tight. What happens when there's this 30% peak season on top of where we are today? And I think in that scenario, if you find yourself in that situation, the key is talk to your carrier and see what you can do just to reserve that space in advance. Now, again, it's probably going to be a premium product, but at least there's this outlet there, because my guess is there's going to be a ton of demand for those types of services, and they're going to fill up quickly. So the more you can get out there and indicate to your carriers that, hey, this is something I'm interested in, I think from a carrier standpoint, they'd be very happy to say, hey, Bryan, oh, you need this now. Let's set a framework of agreement to cover that surge, whether it's a flex, whether that's just a specific 3-month contract to cover the surge, something along those lines. And my sense is carriers would be interested to do that, but that capacity is going to be available, but it's not going to be available forever.
So you bring up this interesting term, kind of premium services. You and I have talked before about the value of committed deals, traditional deals. I don't know if we talked a lot about premium services, but can you just explain kind of the difference of a premium service, the pros and cons of a premium service versus either a traditional or committed type of arrangement?
Yeah. So premium services vary from carrier to carrier, and I think each carrier has started to develop their own program. But in a very generic sense, it means that it's something on top of your extra rate and of your current rate. And that means you're going to get some different level of priority, whether that means you're going to get no roll guarantee or you're going to be prioritized on the ship. And oftentimes there's some sort of money back component, meaning that if I don't load you, you're going to get your money back. I think the challenge with these types of products is that you just don't know if they're going to be there. So they can get sold out pretty quickly from one week to the next. And usually there's a number of people who are trying to get these at the same time. So I think while they're good and they're a helpful thing for the market, if I'm a shipper, if I wait too long, I might find myself that, oh, there isn't any of that capacity available. And now I'm a little bit stuck, which is why I think thinking about these things in advance, and the more you can do it in advance and the more you can commit to a carrier in advance, is going to really help you secure some of that capacity. But you can wait, but two things can happen. One is the price can change, and two is it may not be available.
Yeah. I think it's just really important for shippers to know that if they're going to pursue premium services, to your point, they are different across carriers. So just be sure that you fully understand the fine print on how they work and what you're committing to and what you're getting, just so you don't feel confident in a solution and maybe you don't get exactly what you'd hope for. So that's good advice. I appreciate you clarifying that. I think the other thing, Don, that you could think about is just kind of a shorter term approach. If you're a shipper that says, hey, I'm still not bought in that this market is going to turn out the way everybody says, and I still have 20,000 TEUs that I have to cover, and maybe I'll just take a quarterly approach and just say, I'm just going to quarter by quarter go with this thing. I'm going to roll the dice. Maybe I win, maybe I lose from a price standpoint, but there still could be access to capacity through quarterly types of arrangements. Again, whether they're committed deals like we do on NYSHEX or with NVOs. What do you think about that approach? And do you think quarterly deals are an option?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that there's quite a bit of momentum to think differently, and there's momentum to not do it the same way we did it before, where we just had a contract and it was 52 MQC divided by 52, and that's what I thought I'm going to get. And I think there's a lot of thought around, does that really work? And you can debate whether or not it works. But if you start looking at quarterly kind of deals, which is not so alien to other trade lanes in the world, that works well in a sense that people know better what they're going to do in the next quarter than what they are in the next year. So I think from a carrier perspective, to think more short term and to think, oh, I have a 90-day commitment and I have more certainty around what those volumes are going to look like. I think that's very appealing for a carrier. It I think the concern I would have as a shipper is, after that 90 days, what does that look like? And there could be more price volatility in that type of scenario depending on the market condition. So if you can live with that, though, I think from a carrier perspective, they're certainly open to it, and they're already doing it in other trade lanes.
I think that's a great perspective. Obviously, we've been talking more trans-Pacific eastbound focus just because we're in the heat of that contracting season. But I think you're right. Sometimes when you're doing these retros and figuring out what happened, what do I do different, you can look to other trades, right, around the world. And you may be a shipper that doesn't do business in other trades, but if you go in and you take a look at how maybe Asia Europe works or intra Asia works, or maybe some of the north south trades, you might be able to learn something, because to your point, those are trades that move a tremendous amount of volume, and it could be done completely different than the way it's been done in the Trans-Pacific. So I think it's a great perspective to take a look at how some of those things work, what the pros and cons are, and if you could incorporate some of that as part of your strategy. One of the other things you brought up earlier was this idea of extra loaders. Sometimes I think shippers have a perspective of, if I'm not one of the top 10 biggest of big shippers and I don't have thousands of TEUs to commit to one sailing, that I can't get access. Is that the case, or what advice would you give to shippers on what you should be prepared for, or how you should position yourself to take advantage of an extra loader if it's available?
Yeah, I think it's available to really anybody. I just think it's a matter of timing more than anything. So if somebody's and frankly, some carriers have announced now that they have an extra loader in, let's say, May. So if you wait until April 25th and say, like, hey, by the way, Bryan, I'd like to get on your extra loader, the odds of there being space available is limited, and the price might be really high for that. If you start talking about it now and say, like, hey, listen, I'm willing to commit here to your extra loader, and talk to a carrier about what you can do, then I think you're going to find a lot more success. So I think it's as much a timing issue as anything. But I think it goes back to one of those things we were talking about earlier, which is, be upfront with your carrier and give them as much notice as you can that you're interested to do this, because you might be helping tip the scales for the carrier to think about, like, what we should have an extra loader, because there's a challenge of getting the capacity for the extra loader. The second challenge for the carrier is deciding what are the ports that extra loader is going to call. And again, these are not just one day to the next type of decisions. It takes time for carriers to make these decisions and to set this up. So the more information you can give them and give them some comfort and security that if I do deploy this extra loader, that I have enough demand to fill it, then they're going to be more willing to do it. So it's just that communication. But I would again try and do it with as much notice as you can, because I think that's really going to help the carriers, and you're going to find yourself a lot happier than, again, last minute. It's going to be tough, and that could be good, it could be bad. It's hard, it's anybody's guess.
Well, it's encouraging to know that there might be some planning and some time to think about those extra loaders, but some may come up and there isn't a ton of notice. So, my final point to shippers would be what we've talked about before. Again, control what you can control. We've talked a lot about how there's so many stakeholders in your supply chain that hopefully you've engaged throughout this process, and letting them know of the disruption that is currently in the supply chain, that will probably continue to be in the supply chain, and this idea of having some flexibility within your own organization, because some other strategies could be, hey, if I don't want to pay these significant peak season premiums, maybe I can smooth my volume a bit. Maybe I can move some one way, move some the other way, and take the top off of a peak. And maybe that's less peak season surcharge that I'm paying. Or it might be having this relationship with sourcing and procurement and your factory production that says, I need to be able to be a bit flexible as this flex capacity or as these extra loaders come, that we have very clear lines of communication that allow us to either accelerate or potentially slow down just a bit, so you can get this timing just right. But these are things I think as a shipper you could say, despite everything else that's happening outside of me, there are things that I can prepare my internal organization for to be a bit more flexible than we have in the past, to one, either take advantage of opportunities, or two, to minimize premiums or challenges that I might face, because I personally continue to believe that this is probably the environment we continue to operate in. And I don't see it getting any easier or better necessarily for shippers. So everything you can do within your control to, again, make yourself as a customer of choice for your carrier partners and have flexibility to be able to take advantage of opportunities is truly going to benefit you.
Yeah, you keep stealing what I want to say before I say it, but I was because I was going to say that this ties right back into something we talked about in earlier shows, which was customer of choice. And from a carrier perspective, if you have the ability to throttle your volumes up or down based on what type of capacity opportunities carriers might have, it's really super attractive. And you talk about partnership and working with your suppliers and being a customer of choice. An ability to kind of flex up or down and control that based on agreements that you're making with the carriers is really huge. And again, I go back to something we talked about a long time ago. Carriers are still struggling with the fact that they have about 40% fall down globally. They don't know what volume's really going to show up or not. This creates all these network problems for the carriers. So the more I can maneuver and make my volumes more certain to the carrier, the more attractive it's going to be for them, because again, these assets that they're managing, whether they're ships or containers, it's a challenge for them. And if you can help be part of the solution for them, very appealing for a carrier.
Well, cool. Well, I certainly don't mean to steal your thunder, but we don't always agree on things as shippers and carriers, but it sounds like this is certainly one we agree on. So maybe there's a bit of value in what we're talking about today.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I want to we talk a lot about trade lanes and other things, and I want to ask you a question because I think it's something I keep seeing come up in the media and online, is this discussion around carriers and exports, and are carriers obligated to take on export cargo? I think there's quite a bit of pressure in Washington to do something about the exports, and should carriers support them? And I just would love to get your thoughts on, do you feel like carriers are responsible to take export cargo?
At the end of the day, I think they are. However, I do think that there needs to be this efficiency, right, in the supply chain, whether it's head haul or back haul. So I think this is just where, if you're an exporter, you need to think about what is the rate that I'm paying? What are the free time requirements that I'm placing? All of those things that we've talked about, and knowing and understanding that carriers don't have the buffer or flexibility anymore on backhaul legs. Obviously, that empty container is like pure gold for a head haul, to be able to come back to the U.S. or to go to whatever market it's going to go to. So I think this is where exporters for a long time maybe didn't have to think about being a customer of choice or thinking about leaning out their supply chain, to where they maybe are a bit more favorable for a carrier. And so if you have various inland points, if you have excessive free time, or if you have rates that are a couple $100 that are certainly not going to be profitable for the carrier, I think you have to think about that. So I think it's kind of a two-way street. I think, yes, the carriers are responsible. It's a service that they offer. It's a need for global economies to do backhauls or exports. But I also think from a shipper perspective, you've got to be realistic and say that I've got to be an important part of this equation, and I've got to evaluate my network while I do that.
Yeah. From my perspective, I do think carriers are obligated to carry exports. I think it's part of the Shipping Act, as part of the common carriage, that they aren't allowed to engage in any unfair practices, which it might be a little vague, but that's the way the rules are written. And I do think that from a political standpoint, that there's so much push to support exporters, at least from a political perspective and in Washington, because that's U.S. manufacturing that you're sending out, right? So there is quite a bit of regulatory things, and I don't believe that the carriers are necessarily saying we don't want exports. I think the thing you touched on is that the price has changed, and I think that as long as carriers are offering a price, and they should offer prices that are compensatory to them. And as long as they're doing that, and again, that affects exports, but they are a for-profit business. They are there to try and make money, and they have to do things where they're going to provide a result. They have shareholders or governments that they have to answer to. So they have to charge the rates that they feel are fair. And that might be changing a bit on the export side, and I think those rates have a ton of upward pressure. But I think as long as carriers are saying this is how much it'll cost to do something, then it should feel like, that might be the new normal, but that's kind of how it is.
Yeah, no, I think it's great perspective. Well, as always, Don, it was great having a discussion with you. And even though we're not necessarily with shippers and carriers anymore, we are still pretty busy. So I'm not sure we'll be on the golf course anytime soon, but I hope one day I can get out there with you.
Yeah, that'd be great. We need the weather to improve a little bit here in New Jersey in order to do that. It's been a rough go, but one day I'm sure it's going to happen.
Fair enough. Sounds good.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.